And this is a long story. So officially and formally, we know that the Kazakhs, got united in the mid 15th century, right? So that was the wandering of the two Chingizid sultans, Girey and Janibek, 1452. But again, that was kind of a custom practice, a custom nomadic practice of simply showing and demonstrating disobedience. They wandered off from the ulus of Abu Khair, whose descendant was Shaiban Khan, Shaibani. They simply demonstrated his disobedience, and they wandered off to the region called Mogulistan, which is now corresponds the region of Semirech, Jetesu, so 7 rivers. That's in the south of Kazakhstan. So many things happened from that time, but still the nomadic Kazakhs were not united. I mean, all these 3 hordes or juzis, right? Hundreds. So they were not united under a single rule because all these khans were pretty much bickering and competing with each other, right? So, and that was a normal practice of the steppe political negotiations and relationships. What again concerns the Kazakh nation, the unification started under the Soviets. So the creation of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, which for the first time was also given this titular name, Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, because the Kazakhs figured in various imperial sources and also other sources under different names. So there were Kazakh, Kazakh Kaysaks, and they were also pretty much called Kyrgyz, and so on and so forth. So for the first time, they truly got unified under this Kazakh name under the Soviets. That was the delimitation campaign in Central Asia, which was held by the central government in Moscow of the 20th century. Right, and then it continued. So for the first time, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic was created in 1936. So it became one of the titular republics of the former Soviet Union. How this delimitation process was unfolding and how it was implemented. It was implemented according to the Stalinist formula, right? In accordance with which a nation should have these 2 basic attributes: common territory, common economy, common lifestyle, language, and indeed common lifestyle, which was by Stalin formulated as a makeup, psychological makeup. So we simply call it culture. Right? So these 4 attributes were necessary for a nation to exist. So I don't want to go back to how Stalin was elaborated on his formula, but the point is that all these Bolshevik leaders and also native communists, not only Moscow Russian communists, but the Kazakh native communists also very actively took part in this campaign of the delimitation of Central Asia. So these 4 attributes were used as a formula, as a basis, as a guiding lines, right, for the creation of any Soviet nation, including also the Kazakh nation. Religion obviously was not, well, it was taken into consideration, but it definitely figured as a culture, right? So it was, under the Soviets, religion pretty much was transformed into a culture. And as a culture became indispensable attribute of every Soviet nation. Nomadism obviously was taken into consideration, but it was also considered, the thing of the past, which had to be overcome. The Kazakhs, as Soviet citizens, were in fact given only three options, basically, to become either Kazakh workers, right, to create a Kazakh proletariat, or to join the Soviet peasantry, which is basically become Soviet kolkhozniki, right, or Soviet peasants. And indeed, the third option was to form Kazakh Soviet intelligentsia. So these three classes were recognized by the Soviet regime as constituting the basis and the main structure of the organization of Soviet society. Right? So that's nothing specific, nothing unique, because the Kazakhs simply went through this general process of the Soviet delimitation campaign. And the delimitation campaign was conducted everywhere, all over, throughout the whole Soviet Union. It's not only Central Asia, because we know that all these 15 republics were also created one by one during this period of the Soviet nation building. The Kazakh Khanate was much more flexible, body. So we can talk about the Kazakh Khanates, but this notion was sort of, changing permanently, because we know that it was only some very short period under Tolibi, right, when finally the Tolibi was a customary judge, main judge B, right, or stemming from the senior court, Ulujus. And he was able, precisely because of his charisma, because of his personal characteristics, because of his of absolutely overwhelming, respect of him. He was able to, for a moment, unite three Juzes. But then that was just a moment in history, because each of these Juzes, we should probably talk about Juzes rather than Khanates. Right? So all these Juzes went their own ways. So we know that the Khans of the Middle Horde were pretty much in dispute with the Khans of the Junior Horde, right? And the Khans of the senior Kazakh horde, they submitted themselves to the Kokand rulers, right? So by the time Russia was, spreading out over those regions, and that was a pretty typical situation, because all these Khans, they were, competing with each other for superiority, right? For having this superior role and being able to undermine other rivals. And of course, it was quite a difficult issue, right? It was quite a challenging enterprise. And only few nomadic rulers were able to go through this unification process. One of them is famously Chinggis Khan, obviously, right? And also his descendants, precisely because of the charismatic, nature of the charismatic rule, and many other attributes. But that's should be considered exception, because each time when this unification succeeded, it was mainly and in the first place due to these charismatic personalities of nomadic rulers. But otherwise, the political situation in the steppe was always a constant rivalry and competition. For example, even the descendants of Chinggis Khan, so the third generation probably still was sort of, precisely because of of the charismatic grandfather, they were pretty much able to monopolize, to concentrate power. But the next generation of the Chingizids, they already went astray. And that is unfortunately, it probably would be not quite correct to say fortunately or unfortunately. It's just simply the nature how political power and the idea of sovereignty and rulership and submission and so on and so forth, how all these mechanisms operated in the steppe. It was quite unique and completely different from how this idea of a superior rulership operated in sedentary societies. Even in the neighboring Russia or in the neighboring, Kokand or Bukharan Emirate or Central Asian other states, this monopolization of power in the steppe was quite a challenging enterprise and very rare. So especially when we talk about large tribes, huge territories and so on and so forth. That happened in history, but it was rather an exception. There was a hierarchy within each, Rus, horde or 100 tribe. There were a hierarchy of tribes. And that hierarchy was also strictly followed in economic way of life, in economies, everyday economies, right? It followed also in, for example, not only in marriages, but also, everyday life. For example, how a person should behave toward somebody coming from a tribe which is higher in hierarchy than his own tribe, right? So that was established, the codes of behavior, the norms of behavior, right? So how you should, for example, treat people who are coming from, tribes which is in that particular hierarchy are higher than your own tribe. So, for example, in guest parties, you should offer them the most respected place. So in a yurt, in a tent, right? So and so on and so forth. So in the whole this, even code of behavior, norms of behavior, morals, everything was built on that particular identification, tribal identification. That played absolutely crucial role. We know, for example, that Sherbina expedition indicated a very interesting fact that, for example, if representatives from two kinship groups, right, not related necessarily directly to each other, come to the same pasture land, right, how they decide who should occupy this land. They decide this in accordance with, again, these tribal hierarchies. So they simply ask each other, where are you from? From what tribe are you? And if they find out that, this particular person who is kind of from a higher, status of that in that particular tribal hierarchy, then that person has the right to occupy this pasture. And there was no disputes or debates. So how they could simply mark that territory that it's a Kazakh territory? No, nomads did not recognize any territorial boundaries, right? Because it contradicted the nature of the economy. They had to move constantly and permanently because being stuck and somehow bounded to certain territory could absolutely ruin the economy. Right? They were very much dependent on nature. And nature was very, very capricious, as you can. Well, usually it used to be capricious, right? And unpredictable, especially in the steppe, in this very sharp continental region, right? So this year you might have absolutely marvelous Jailao summer pasture, right? But next year it could be completely, taken away by locust, right? Destroyed by a locust. And so on and so forth. The same thing is with winter pastures. So it means you had to be mobile in order to survive, because, and you had to be able to, permanently change your territories, pasture territories, in order to enable your livestock, enable your animals, sufficient grass, sufficient fodder, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely, precisely this way of life also dictated the nature of political relationships. Nomads, it was absolutely very well established practice. If they did not approve of the rulers, they simply wandered off, period, right? And no ruler could keep them or hold them, right? Or impose on them anything. So this type of very flexible relationships, right, also dictated the way how the superior ruler or khans, had to behave with respect to even very ordinary nomads, let alone strong tribal leaders who always presented a challenge. I believe that we have to rewrite the Soviet period of Kazakh history. It not only, it relates not only to Kazakh history, it relates to the history post-Soviet historiography of all populations of the former Soviet Union. Because again, we just cannot accept it. I mean, accept this already established view of that particular, of the history of the Soviet Union as a sort of, the continuation of the imperial history, right? So with those Bolsheviks coming and taking lands and, brainwashing, taking languages, taking cultures, brainwashing all these non-Russian nationalities and behaving like colonizers, right? So that is a very simplified and very dangerous, a very blind way of treating the history of the Soviet Union in black and white colors, right? That's what we call Manichaeist approach. So on the one hand, we have these victims, right? Of course, nationals and non-Russians, right? And on the other hand, we have those colonizers, right? Masters. So, of course, history never works in this way. History is a very complex and very controversial in its by its nature. Right. So, in other words, we have to complicate that history because this the Soviet period of Kazakh history pretty much also demonstrates very clearly and very vividly that the Soviet regime was giving with one hand and taking away with other hand. So, how to find that balance between these two hands? So, it was killing its own citizens, but at the same time, it was giving them, the languages, the territories, the protection, the sovereignty, if you like, right? The acknowledgement of the, of the names, of the titular names, and so on and so forth. So that's very difficult to do. I mean, to bring that together, somehow reconcile. But that's a duty, I believe, of historians of the next generation, and not only historians, but also all workers, of culture and education, all people who work in this sphere of culture and education, because writing or accepting this history as it is now being written, right, from the very nationalist point of view, it's in fact ending up dividing us of our own true historical legacy. So without our roots, without our legacy, how are we going to build our future, right? And how are we going to perceive of our reality, which is unfolding right now in front of our eyes? So it means it's absolutely an urgent task, in my view, to reevaluate the Soviet period of Kazakh history, and not only the Soviet period of Kazakh history, but also, the history of the Soviet Union. The nomadic history is a fascinating subject in its own. And you can imagine that how little, not only American students, but even our students, I should say, how little they know about how nomadic societies operated, how they were unique in so many ways. We talk just about political culture, but there are so many other aspects of, that civilization. Nurbulat Masanov, our famous Soviet historian, right, wrote the book which he titled the nomadic civilization of Kazakhs, Кочевая цивилизация казахов, right? So he, for the first time, used this term civilization, and that was, a pretty bold, very kind of encouraging, and at the same time very, pioneering step. He, for the first time, defined this society, this, the whole this phenomenon as civilization, because unfortunately, especially in the Western anthropology, nomads, and also in the Marxist-Leninist ideology, by the way, right, in that particular formula, nomads always representing a very backward, sort of absolutely, undeveloped, the backwater of history of humanity, because they didn't have states, right, of European type, because they didn't have the written traditions, because they didn't build huge, beautiful buildings, right? And they didn't invent their own scripts and so on and so on. So they were lacking all aspects, all, sort of attributes of a cultured person, right? So from the Chinese point of view, they were just barbarians, period. So unfortunately, nomads did remain barbarians in the European anthropology and in the European history. They were a kind of prehistory of humanity. So they were kind of pre-stage to the history of civilized societies, right? So, and Nurbulat Masanov, for the first time, pretty much argued that, in fact, nomadism just represented another type of civilization, not necessarily of European nature, and also not necessarily sharing also, common cultural features, but at the same time also pretty much, developing their own, their own visions, their own structures, their own political structures, also cultural forms, and so on and so forth. So that is, of course, to look at Kazakh history from this point of view, it's, of course, a pretty much refreshing perspective, right? An eye-opening perspective. And that's what makes these American students, not only American students, but I would also argue even Kazakh students, right? Pretty much interested and excited about learning that, the unique nature of nomadism, of nomadic histories, of nomadic societies. What is so unique about them, including also Kazakh society?